Yeah, did you ever, do you sometimes wonder what it would be like to live in ancient India at the time of the Buddha? And so today you can find out, because I thought I'd take you on a little time travel to the time of the Buddha. And yeah, so basically to ancient India, to 500 BC. And so the main purpose of the Suttas and the Vinaya is to preserve the teaching of the Buddha and the monastic discipline. But apart from that, he also gets basically a fascinating glimpse of life in ancient India. I mean, in basically in every detail, which is very unusual, because usually we don't have that many reports from ancient India in 500 BC. So there you get to know things about culture, society, family life, architecture, what professions and crafts existed, how people are dressed, what they ate, what kind of ancient Indian medicines existed, what diseases they had. So yeah, like basically every detail. And I think it's quite a rare thing that one gets so much information about a culture 2,500 years ago. Yeah, so maybe to start with, as a background information, they're similar like ancient Egypt, the Middle East and China. India was one of the earliest places where human civilization started. So in 500 BC, at the time of the Buddha, India had already experienced 2,500 years of human civilization. So long before the Buddha, there was already the Indus Valley or Harappa civilization. Look at some little pictures. And yeah, so this Indus Valley civilization, it started already about 5,000 years ago, in about 3000 BC, and it lasted for 2000 years until 1000 BC. And the largest cities already had about 30,000 to 60,000 people living in the cities. They had already large-scale urban planning with sewage and these things, and the cities were mostly made out of bricks, the buildings. And they had also writing, various crafts. They had standardized measurements in weights. They had trade via ship and elaborate arts. So you can see it is already quite well developed. These, let's say, the statues that they make, and this sort of clay, whatever, vases and all kinds of things. And so, at least I thought it's good to mention that as well, that the culture in which the Buddha was living didn't just come out of nowhere at the time, but at the time when we had the ancient Greek civilization in Europe, then India could look back already on 2,500 years of civilization. So it was already ancient in 500 BC. And so, so in the basically about 200 years before the Buddha, they made some discovery in ancient India that changed the way of life of people. Iron was discovered in several places, and so the iron had been known in India already several hundred years before, but the iron that they found at that time was better quality, so it was closer to the surface and could be mined and smelted more easily. And so before that, iron was more like rare and occasionally used, but then after that it became more widespread. So basically then every farmer could have some iron plow or some iron tools like hoes and spades, and say iron sickles made it easier to harvest crop. iron nails held together wooden structures. And another thing was that because of these iron tools, then they could clear forests very easily. So then, at that time, most of northern India was also covered with forests, but then they could clear these forests and use this land for agriculture. Then, so because of these changes, there was more food surplus, the population grew, and villages grew into towns, and towns into large cities. And so, at the time of the Buddha, there were 16 different countries in northern India, so it was divided into smaller different countries. They are mentioned in the discourses of the Buddha, and the largest and most powerful ones were the kingdom of Magadha, with Rajagaha's capital, and the kingdom of Kosala, with Savatthi and Varanasi as largest cities, and then the country of the Vachis, with Vesali as capital. For example, the kingdom of the Sakyans, that was rather a smaller kingdom in the north, and so in the suttas it's even mentioned that they were actually vassals of the king of Kosala. So it's the suttas, in one place of the suttas, it even says the Sakyans, they offer humble service and salutation to King Pasenadi and do his bidding and pay him homage. So they were actually subordinate to the kingdom of Kosala, or part of it. So after this little overview, maybe so let's have a look at what these cities actually looked like, and what life was like in one of the largest cities at the time of the Buddha, in Vesali, it's the capital of the Vachi country. And so that leads to the question, do we have any information or even images maybe of Indian architecture in 500 BC at the time of the Buddha? And yes, we have, because on the one hand we have information in the Vinaya, the monastic discipline. The Buddha gave very detailed regulations what kind of buildings are allowable, what they can be made of, to what extent they can be decorated, and then also from various stories in the Vinaya and the Suttas, you get some information of like major buildings, what kind of buildings existed in a city at the time and where they were located. Yeah, but not only that, we also have more or less images where you can see how Indian architecture looked like more than 2,000 years ago. And they are on reliefs of ancient Buddhist stupas. The stupas in Sanchi and Bharut. And they are from about 150 BC. So, some images, some Indian architecture. And yeah, 150 BC, that's just about 250 years from the time of the Buddha's final Nibbana. So on one of these reliefs on the gateway of Sanchi, you even see a city under siege by an army. And yeah, you can see, for example, on the city gate, you see the city gate with these towers on the side, with a gabled roof structure. So you can see the details, how they constructed some fortifications, and then you also see other reliefs also show various buildings with a similar style. So for example, on one of these panels there, you can see a little ceremonial fire hut of fire worshippers, or like a simple mud hut of some ascetic with leaves, thatched with leaves. And you can also see some huts in Jetavana, under the Pindikas monastery. So one of these lower images has some, basically shows Jetavana with some huts, some meditation huts in there. And so there's even one older example of Indian architecture, how a peaked roof building or like a hut looked like, and that's from the time of King Asoka. This is 250 BC. And so basically it's an entrance to a cave, King Ashoka donated some caves which were basically chiseled into rock, and then this artist, stonemason who made these caves, at the entrance of the cave he designed it the style basically like a hut of an ascetic or a monk. And so you can see basically these main upright posts inclining toward inwards, and then some decoration and lattice work with a window under the roof. And yeah, so more or less it's like you have the design of what some little huts looked like at the time of King Ashoka. And I think that's the oldest really intact architecture of India that has survived anywhere, because before King Ashoka you only have more or less this sort of brick walls of the Harappa civilization, but you wouldn't see what really the whole building looked like. Yeah, and this was only 150 years after the Buddha. Let's say this cave entrance shows the design of a hut, or like what architecture looked like. Yeah, and so based on this gate of Sanchi, then here's some conceptual drawing what a city in ancient India might have looked like. Basically, based on these stupas and this entrance to this, it's called Loma Rishi Cave. And yeah, so you can get some impression of this Indian architecture. And so yeah, basically, let's say if you would imagine you would walk towards the city of Vesali, then the first thing that you would see is the city wall. And so the city wall would have some towers and walkways with a peak roof structure on top for patrolling on it. And already in 500 BC, the cities had elaborate fortifications. For example, the city of Rajagaha, which was another large city in northern India at the time, it had a 40-kilometer long city wall. And yeah, it was made of rocks, which were sort of roughly fitted together. And if you visit Rajagaha today, which is called Rajgir, then you can still see parts of this ancient city wall at the time of the Buddha. And in this case, the city was located in surrounded by hills, so it could be defended easily. And then they built a city wall made of stone around the whole city, around these hills, on top of them. Vesali didn't have a city wall made of stone, so it was probably made of earth. If it would have been of stone, they would have found some archaeological remains of it. And archaeological excavations, they show that these walls that they made at the time were about 7 or 8 meters high and 3 meters wide. Yeah, more or less made of like earth, like rammed earth. And so there's even like a little description from some defensive structures of a city in the Suttas, in a sutta that you know probably already, Anguttara Nikaya 667. Sorry, Anguttara Nikaya 767. And so here basically this city has a citadel which has a deep base and is securely planted, immobile and unshakable. And this city has a moat which is dug deep and wide. And it has a patrol path which is high and wide. And there's a rampart which is high and wide and covered with coat of plaster. So yeah, just like as example in this images, basically this one is rammed earth walls, and then on top a walkway and sort of maybe plastered and covered. And the cities usually had 4 gates in the 4 directions, And the eastern gate was considered the most auspicious one and the main gate of the city. And the southern gate was considered the most inauspicious one, because south of the city was the charnel ground or cremation site. They carried the dead people out there, and also the criminals were led through the city and then out to the southern gate and then executed there in the south of the city. And also the rubbish dump was in the south of the city. Then so maybe a little reminder before we sort of go into the city. Basically every detail that I'm describing now, what you can see there is either from the Suttas and Vinaya from 400 BC or from archaeological excavations, and you will be sort of surprised what level of detail one can actually describe an ancient city in India. So if we would enter the city by the main eastern gate, then first we would encounter the gatekeeper and a few soldiers who are checking out people who want to enter the city for any suspicious activity. And the gatekeeper was also responsible for checking the city walls for any damage, that no one can get inside. And at the city gate, we would also encounter a procedure we are familiar with, customs declaration. So they already had this as well in 2,500 years ago. The kings, they would set up custom ports or custom points at rivers where they had to cross over the river, or some mountain passes or city gates to collect fees from caravans. And so after we've entered the city, then we would encounter a nice feature of ancient Indian cities. At the city gates, they often had public rest houses for travelers, where basically travelers could stay overnight. So basically like a hospitality service to whoever travels and comes to the city. And also alms centers where poor people could get some simple food and some other basic requisites, like some very simple clothing for free. Yeah, because many people at that time believed that good actions and helping others has good results in this life and in future lives. Because of that, kings and rich people who wanted to do some meritorious actions, they would get these places built, and then they also financed them continuously for the benefit of everyone. So there wasn't, in this sense, like a social security system like we have it, but it was more or less expected that the king would do some charity, or some rich people would do some charity to help other people, and so that, let's say, poor people could get some simple requisites, or some traveling people could just have some place where they can rest and get some and stay for a little bit of time. Yeah, so obviously the first thing we would notice in the city of Vesali is what the buildings look like, and then how people are dressed. So according to the Vinaya, the buildings at the time of the Buddha were made either of wood, or earth, or bricks, or stone. The archaeological evidence shows that almost all the buildings at the time of the Buddha were made from wood or earth. Yeah, because there are only very rarely any buildings from 500 BC made from bricks or stone. While the cities of the Indus Valley civilization that you saw, which was 2,000 years before the Buddha, they found huge cities made of bricks. They were excavated, so obviously they didn't exist at the time of the Buddha, so they had these earth or wooden buildings mostly. And also, if you visit the Buddhist holy sites now, the buildings, often you see some brick structures, and they're mostly from a later time. So they're maybe 500 years or sometimes even 1,000 years after the Buddha, because these monasteries were then inhabited a long time, so maybe places like Jetavana or places in Rajgir, they would be then inhabited for maybe 500,000 years, and then later they built these brick buildings. They had gabled buildings and barrel-vaulted buildings, multi-storied buildings and huts. And the roofs, they were covered with grass or leaves or tiles, plaster or stone. And also the same material was used for the walls. And the walls, they could be plastered inside and outside with white or dark or ochre plaster. Yeah, poor people or simple farmers, they probably were just living in some wooden huts or some shack covered with some thatched grass or leaves. Well, yeah, if people are more wealthy, it may be some simple single-floor house with a few rooms and a roof structure made of wood covered with tiles. And then even more wealthy people would have large multi-storied buildings, maybe 2 floors made of earth, and then another one on top, a wooden floor. And then the roof was usually flat, and they used it like a terrace with a gabled pavilion on top. It's described often that rich people sitting on their terrace on top of their mansion is something that regularly gets described in the suttas, I mean sometimes at least. Yeah, and in the large palaces, they even just a section where the queens were living was so big that maybe several hundred people would live there. However, it seems that even these large palaces, they were made from earth and wood, because then, 150 years after the Buddha, at the time of King Asoka, they found various stone monuments, while at the time of the Buddha, there's nothing really from that time made out of stone in the same scale of construction. Also, I think when most people think about Indian palaces, what comes to mind is of the Taj Mahal or Fort of Agra or Red Fort. And so that's usually what people think about an Indian palace, but obviously this is Islamic style buildings which were made 2000 years after the Buddha. In 500 BC there was nothing like that, and the buildings were just, as I said, more simple, made of earth and wood. Yeah, as you walk through the city, you would also notice that the houses of more wealthy people are, they're covered not only with plaster, but they also have different decorative designs on the walls. So some of the houses, they have garland designs painted on the plaster. Some of them, some creeper designs, some geometric dragon teeth designs, or 5-petal designs. Yeah, later we can also have a closer look inside one of the houses, but maybe first let's have a look how people dressed in India in 500 BC. The people used clothing made from hemp or jute, and linen and cotton and silk. A few examples. And at that time, cloth was rather expensive because everything was hand woven, which is very time consuming. So it is basically it's weaving structures, and then takes a very long time. And then to dye new cloth, they would use natural dye, for example from indigo or safflower. People would wear an upper and a lower garment. These were just rectangular pieces of cloth, and so the lower garment was wrapped around and folded around the hips and legs, and similar like a skirt more or less, and then held together with a belt. And then the upper garment was wrapped around the chest to cover it. Yeah, obviously how people dressed was very much dependent on how wealthy they were. So let's say farmers or workers would probably just wear some old worn-out hemp clothing. then people with higher income, they would wear some better quality cotton or linen cloth with some jewelry. And so, for example, if you wanted to see what rich people or aristocratic people would wear, then could have a look at a young group of Lichavis from the sort of leading aristocratic clan, sometimes driving around in some chariots. And so they are from the Khattiya caste, usually it's translated as noble warriors, but not all Khattiya were actually noble warriors. It's more like basically aristocracy, would be, I think, more correct translation. And so some of them, it says they were dressed all in blue with matching blue jewelry, or some in yellow with matching jewelry, or in red or white. And the most expensive clothing was imported silk from Varanasi. And Varanasi is still famous for silk, even today as well. So Varanasi is a quite ancient city. It comes from somewhere else, but it was not originally from Varanasi, but it was like a trading port where it. Of course, it was a secret. I think it was kept secret. And it has this very thin, divine-like, pleasant touch to it, so they liked it very much, even in the Roman Empire and so on. So, so some images from reliefs where you can basically see how, for example, a wealthy man would dress. They would wear some turbans, which wasn't really religious, didn't have any religious significance. It just makes you look more important, something like that. And also unusual for us to see that men would also wear jewelry and makeup. And so you can see in the earlobes, they have some, not just earrings, but they have really some big plugs in them. And they are wearing necklaces around the neck and bracelets around the arms, even the men. And they also would paint their eyes with black coryllium, something like a kind of makeup. And there's even this story with Venerable Nanda, the Buddha's half-brother. Then after he became a monk already, he goes to see the Buddha, and then he's wearing kind of beautiful, well-ironed robes, and he's painting his eyes, and it's a beautiful, shiny glazed bowl. And then the Buddha is admonishing him and saying, I should really just eat only alms food and live at the root of a tree and wear some rag robes and be indifferent towards these kind of things, because it's not appropriate for a monk. Obviously, he was used to a different lifestyle, and he just liked to beautify himself, because he was more or less also one of the potential heirs to the throne. And as you can see on these reliefs, women would even wear some more elaborate jewelry if they could afford it. They're wearing multiple bracelets around the ankles, the wrists, the upper arms, and then multiple necklaces and large ear jewelry, decorated belts. They didn't wear turbans, but it looks like they had some cloth covering on the head. Looks like a cap, and then some, diadem, like some jewelry around it, maybe with an ornament on the forehead. And they painted their feet and their hands with henna, just like some Indian women still do today. And also powder and other makeup was used already at that time. But so more or less, they also styled their hair in 8-fold plaits. So and they didn't use gel to style their hair, but they had oil with beeswax or oil with water. So they even had this sort of similar thing like we have today with gel to style their hair. But they're obviously only the wealthiest, maybe 5 to 10% of the population, they would dress like this. And this was already more like, obviously the most the very wealthy people who would wear this amount of jewelry, otherwise they wouldn't have enough money to afford something like this. Maybe also a question, is this actually accurate? What is displayed on these reliefs? One can question that. So these are from about 150 BC, from these stupas. Interestingly, one can actually, at least there is evidence that this is correct, because there's also, on the Sanchi stupa, there's also a relief which shows more or less the first European Buddhists, basically Greek people, who are at that time, already before that, there was this conquest of Alexander of Macedonia towards India. And so there were also Greek people living there in these kingdoms which came after Alexander. And in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and also in India itself, there were whole cities, more or less Greek-style cities with Greek population. And so this shows the more or less first of European Buddhists worshipping a stupa. And you can see the difference in terms of the dresses and how they are shown. And so they wear some tunics, and then they wear these Greek-style hats or headbands, and they have curly hair, or they use this particular music instruments like flutes or these horns. And so you can see that this really matches in Greek what they were wearing in actually ancient Greek in 500 BC. So you can see on coins from 500 BC or some statues from 500 BC that actually they were wearing this type of dresses. And so it's probably quite accurate what they were wearing or how they showed. Yeah, so for example, also on this Bahut stupa, you can see a Greek warrior. It's not here on the pictures, but so you see some basic Greek-style clothing and how it is quite different from the Indian style, and that they tried to basically show it in a realistic way, more or less, I think. So if you continue basically walking through the city of Vesali, then we would also notice various kinds of crafts that existed during the time of the Buddha. They would sell various products in shops, in the market. So like everyday products and services like potters, basket weavers, cloth weavers, people specialized in dyeing cloth. Then also blacksmiths or carpenters. They would also have some sophisticated tools already, like for example, lathe to turn woods to make round pieces. For carpenters. People would specialize in making chariots or carts or wheels, or all kinds of professions like barbers or soldiers, and farmers, bakers, fishers, hunters, butchers would sell their products. And also professional animal trainers also existed already, so they would specially train horses or elephants. It was already their own profession. There was also already the demand of various luxurious items produced by different professions like goldsmiths, garland makers, florists, confectioners, perfumers, ivory carvers, and then jewelry. They would sell various gems, precious stones like rubies, pearls, beryl. They would also have the ability to make, for example, 8-faceted gems. So they would have techniques to cut and polish precious stones. There were also artists who would paint pictures on canvas or walls. And also there was already increased, basically, because of this food surplus, the growth of the population. Then, there was also basically then a growth of the cities, and then it stimulated the commerce and long-distance trade. And so trade houses and merchants, they would transport various products from one city to another with caravans. And so sometimes it's described in the suttas, they would have caravans with several hundred carts Maybe that sounds a lot, but yeah, I don't think that's exaggerated. For example, a European traveler in India in the 17th century, he witnessed caravans with up to 12,000 carts. And so sometimes the oncoming traffic had to wait for 2 or 3 days that all these carts can pass. So it's like they didn't have, in 17th century, let's say, probably many regions, they didn't have, let's say, a train or whatever, this type of thing. And so they would have this huge sort of carts, caravans going from whatever, let's say, maybe from Varanasi to Delhi or something like that. And basically, they're transporting goods in this way, apparently.
Maybe in those days they didn't have so many built-up areas like we have.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah. Then so also at that time already bankers and merchants, they would go on business trips to different cities. Can be found in the suttas, you can encounter that. Also together with this increase in trade, the first currency in India appeared around 600 BC. So these were countable units of copper, silver and gold coins. The coins didn't have legends like our coins, but they were punch mark coins. So different style, they were basically some imprinting that is punched into it, and it's a particular different style than our coins. And the standard coin was called kahapana, and they were issued by governments or trading houses and guilds. And obviously, if there's money, then you also need professions like accounting and auditing and calculating. So they also existed already at the time of the Buddha. The craftsmen and merchants, they also formed guilds to oversee and protect their interests. Traditionally, there were 18 guilds, and the presidents, they had access to the king or ruling council, and sometimes they even had some position of the finance minister, for example. So they were of some eminent position. And these guilds were also conducting courts if there were some disputes between the members. So they were settling disputes between different sort of craftsmen. Also professional doctors existed already. So aspiring doctors would study medicine for 7 years. For example, in Taxila, in northern India, I think today it's Afghanistan, or Pakistan actually, I think Pakistan. And so Taxila was already a city in 1000 BC, and it was one of the centers of learning in the ancient world for about 1000 years, from 600 BC to 500 Common Era. And so they would learn everything about different medicines. Medicines can be made out of roots or leaves or fruits, astringent concoctions, resin and salts, and also various forms of treatment and surgery. Dr. Jivaka, the personal doctor of King Bimbisara and the Buddha, also the monks community, he already did successful open brain surgery and intestine surgery. It's also mentioned that he cured leprosy or tuberculosis. So he seemed to be a very knowledgeable doctor. Doctors were also they were well paid. People would offer them a lot of money, or they even offered their whole wealth if they would be able to cure them. Because people knew that the wealth would basically be useless if they die, or if you're not healthy, then have constant pain. You also don't have that much happiness because of your wealth anymore. One example, Dr. Jivaka completes his studies successfully, and then his teacher gives him some small provisions for the journey back home from Taxila to Rajagaha. On the way, young graduated students, Jivaka runs out of money, and then he's looking for someone to basically some work. He looking for someone who needs medical help, and then he cures the wife of a rich householder. Her son and the husband and the daughter-in-law, they're all very happy about it, and they paid him very well. In this way, young Dr. Chivakar, he's just graduated, and then he drives home in a horse chariot with 2 slaves and 16,000 kahapanas in his pocket. So he already, just by treating his first patients, he makes a lot of money. So it was well paid, the doctor profession at that time. Additionally, if doctors were skilled, they could also become very popular and famous. And even kings from other countries would specifically invite them to come to be treated. So they would have to travel maybe 500,000 kilometers, or also 1,000 kilometers to especially get invited by this king and then to treat him. There were also something like hospital halls, like halls for sick people outside of the city, for example, north of Vesali. And as you walk through the city of Vesali, you would also sometimes see some children and teenagers playing or running around. Kids like to play already 2,500 years ago, just like today. And so they would play with toy chariots or toy plows, and with marbles or dices made of stone or clay, also with toy bows and arrows. And the older ones would maybe play some board games. However, you would also notice that most children and teenagers, they would actually be working. They were not just playing around. In 500 BC, children didn't go to school, but they gradually grew up. As they grew up, they helped their parents first with some very simple little jobs, and then as they got older, more and more sophisticated ones. If they were children of farmers or carpenters, they would gradually get introduced to the profession of the parents, and then once the parents got old, they would take over the farm or the workshop when the parents got older. Because of that, the people, they would just continue the same profession as the parents and grandparents and follow the family tradition, and only a few of them would have this idea to start something completely new. It was more like this tradition, family tradition. If your father was a carpenter, you would also become a carpenter, usually in general. Teenagers were considered eligible for marriage at age 16, a bit earlier than today. People are considered adults at age 18. The marriages were arranged by the parents. So the parents tried to find a suitable husband or wife for them. The Buddha encourages the parents to select partners for the children out of compassion, for their benefit and welfare. It was a nice description, because I imagine often they were marrying off their children to someone especially rich, trying to make a good fortune for the family and actually not paying attention whether they really fit together or whether they're harmonious. So I think there were probably different interests than with this decision. Yeah. And yeah, when they got married, then the women would have to leave the home of their parents, and they moved into the home of their husbands and the new father and mother-in-law. There, the young man who just got married, he would just continue to live in the home of his ancestors and with the parents. And while you would be walking through the city of Vesali, you would also notice that there are much more children and young people around than today. Because at the time of the Buddha, it was considered auspicious to have many children and a big family. So if a family would have 5 or 10 children, that was considered very lucky. And especially if the children were all healthy, and then they also had grandchildren, Exactly, yeah.
They need that for security.
Yeah. One reason was that many would die for various reasons. The other one was obviously that there was also the old age insurance. In a way, to have many children was the old age insurance, because then they would look after the parents. So it was a very different setup. For example, it's mention of Lady Visakha, the foremost woman support of the Buddha, that she had many children and many grandchildren, and they were all healthy, and that she was considered very auspicious. So people would invite her specially first to some religious ceremonies or festivals. Yeah, because she was considered a lucky person, because she had so many healthy children and healthy grandchildren. So different than today, where people don't really think about having 5 or 10 children. Very different sort of.
We can't afford it.
Exactly, not even afford it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Unaffordable and not manageable. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And the young man would just continue to work in the profession he learned from his parents, and the wife would help him with that and manage the household, earn some extra money for the family with some other craft like weaving or knitting. If the family was wealthy, then some families, they would have maybe 5 or 10 workers or servants. Then the woman was also responsible for overseeing and managing the work of the workers and servants, looking after them, distributing food to them, sort of managing the work. And the women were also responsible for protecting and guarding the wealth of the family and looking after it well. Usually men would only marry one wife, but if they were wealthy, they sometimes had 3 or 4 wives. That was at least considered normal in ancient India. If the husband was sufficiently wealthy to support several wives, it was considered normal. And then some kings would even have maybe 10 or more wives. So, yeah, if you imagine you would have 10 wives or 10 husbands, so it must be troublesome, how to say. Imagine it. So. And one discourse, Digha Nikaya 31, the Sigalika Ovada Sutta, and the Buddha is teaching a young man how to relate to his parents and his wife and other social contexts and the people around him. And so, for example, the Buddha tells him he should behave towards his wife basically in the right way by honoring her and by not disparaging her, by giving her authority, and by by being faithful to her, and so providing her with wealth. And so then this idea that if the husband looks well after the wife, then she in turn will be friendly towards him and look after the family well and be respectful to him. And so after the couple got married, they would just continue to live together with their parents, or in case of the wife, the mother and father-in-law, and then first to do the business together with the family, with the parents. And then when the parents would get older, they would take over the farm or the business. And they would also look after the parents. And obviously it was easier because then the families were larger and they might have 2 or 3 or 5 children who were adults and who would help together to look after them. And the children would have these attitudes towards the parents. They supported us, we will support them, we will do the work and duties for them, and we will continue the family tradition, we will be worthy of our heritage. And then after the parents had passed away, they would do good actions on behalf of the parents in memory of them. So yeah, this was more or less the example of the family life in India in 500 BC. So obviously quite different from today. And I'm not saying that this is the ideal life. This is just, I just try to describe it as it was. And obviously there were some advantages or disadvantages to it, or some, yeah, obviously it was quite different. And so, let's say, for example, I wouldn't recommend to have 5 or 10 children, even though it was considered auspicious at the time of the Buddha. I wouldn't sort of take over this tradition just because it was mentioned in the suttas that it was normal at the time. Yeah.